In the late 1930s, Nazi Germany embarked on an ambitious project to create its first aircraft carrier, the Graf Zeppelin. It was intended to serve as the flagship of a new carrier force that would firmly place the nation among the naval big boys of its day. Named by Hitler himself in honor of aviation pioneer Count Ferdinand von Zeppelin, she was launched on the 8th of December 1938 amid great fanfare. And frankly, you could probably see why, because at over 260 meters in length and displacing around 34,000 tons at full load, she was right up there with the largest carriers of the era. Deep in her belly were to be 42 aircraft, a mix of fighters and dive bombers, and she was scheduled to steam along at a brisk 33 knots, powered by a very powerful, and that is an understatement, 200,000 horsepower turbine plant. Must have been quite thirsty. This configuration would have made her as fast as British and American fleet carriers, capable of projecting German air power far beyond the Baltic and North Sea, areas that had traditionally hemmed in its navy. And yet, as both the title of this video and the tone of this introduction have probably already revealed to you, she never ended up doing that. So, what gives? Why not? Well, to find that out, you just have to hang around and watch the rest of the video, won't you? Let's get into it. Quick pause in the episode to talk about privacy, because if you're online, you are being tracked, and that's a fact. Ooh, that rhymes. That's why, does it? That is why I use Surfshark VPN, not the rhyming thing, but because it protects my privacy. It encrypts your internet traffic, it hides your IP address, and it stops third parties from snooping, whether it's ad networks, your ISP, which is a thing, sketchy, or someone else, a bad actor on airport Wi-Fi. Plus, Surfshark comes with features that you actually use. Clean web blocks ads and malware. Multi-op allows you to route through 2 servers for extra security, and you can use it on limited devices, your laptop, your phone, your tablet. They say smart fridge. I guess that's a joke, but I guess you could if you wanted to. And if you're traveling or just curious, you can switch your virtual location and access content like you're somewhere else. No more of that. This video is not available in your country nonsense. Right now, you can get 4 extra months by going to surfshark.com/mega or using my code MEGA at checkout. Thank you to Surfshark for sponsoring, and now back to today's episode. Germany's inexperience with aircraft carriers. Germany embarked on the Graf Zeppelin project with virtually no experience in aircraft carriers. They had dabbled a bit with seaplane tenders during World War I, as the SMS Santa Elena can attest to, but that was about as far as it went. So, basically bugger all. And with that in mind, the unenviable task of designing the Graf Zeppelin fell to Wilhelm Hadler, a naval engineer who had never even been on an airplane. Well, he was a naval engineer. Further complicating matters, Germany's inexperience with carriers meant that in the early 1930s, not one of its officers actually knew how to operate one of these things. Carriers were a novel technology at the time, one truly mastered only by the British, the Americans, and the Japanese. And this lack of expertise, it forced the Germans to design their carrier largely through deductive reasoning and by gathering as much external information as possible. In 1935, for instance, Britain allowed a German officer to briefly tour their old carrier HMS Furious, brilliantly named, and additional assistance came from Japan when a German commission of Navy and Air Force experts visited Akagi in that same year. The Japanese, clearly allies to be, also generously provided about 100 blueprints of Akagi's fleet deck equipment. While these foreign insights reassured the German planners that their ideas were on the right track, many details still had to be resolved through educated guesswork, a process that led to some, we'll just say, interesting design choices. The Graf Zeppelin's unusual design choices. Alright, the first unorthodox choice was the decision to equip the Graf Zeppelin with not only aerial capabilities, but also offensive ones. Specifically, she was armed with a battery of 16 15cm guns arranged in 8 twin turrets mounted along her sides, essentially giving her the firepower of a light cruiser. This hybrid approach wasn't exactly unprecedented. For example, during the Cold War, the Soviets later adopted a really similar method with their Kiev and Kuznetsov-class aircraft carriers. However, this design philosophy was far from the norm, both at the time and also not at the time. Later developments didn't do it. Still, the choice made sense from the German perspective, as they believed that their carrier would need to defend itself against enemy warships should a Battle of Jutland II scenario arise. Battle of Jutland's revenge, perhaps. Not all logic, however, is created equal. As one naval analyst later noted, the Germans, quoting them, failed to understand that airplanes and not guns were the ship's principal defense. Also notable was Graf Zeppelin's armored flight deck, up to 45mm thick at its broadest points, along with a complementary armored hangar deck underneath. This design marked a significant departure from the US and Japanese carriers, which in the 1930s tended to have wooden flight decks to save weight. Only 100 years ago, everybody. The Germans, much like the British, instead prioritized protection. They reasoned that an armored deck could help the ship survive bomb hits and shell fire, even if it meant having a heavier vessel with a smaller aircraft capacity. Now, on that note, Graf Zeppelin's aerial contingent of 42 aircraft was rather modest by the standards of the day. For example, the Americans could squeeze 96 aircraft onto USS Enterprise if they really pushed it, and the Japanese similarly could fit 73 onto Hiryu, both ships displacing less than the Graf Zeppelin. Even the Brits, who also favored an armored flight deck but didn't burden themselves with the big guns, managed to pack in more aircraft. Ark Royal, for instance, could accommodate 72 aircraft at a theoretical maximum capacity, and also displacing less than the Graf Zeppelin. The struggle for carrier-based aircraft. So, while discussing aircraft, it's really hard not to mention the absolute nightmare that Germany faced when trying to sort out the aircraft for Graf Zeppelin. As with many of the nation's aerial challenges, the blame largely falls on Hermann Goering, the Air Force chief. A well-known character with all the less than admirable traits that come with his reputation, Goering was far from eager to cooperate with the Graf Zeppelin project. In fact, his disdain was so glaring that he famously quipped, quote, "Everything that flies belongs to me." Not going on a power trip there at all, are we, Goering? This attitude meant that the Kriegsmarine had tremendous difficulty securing specialized aircraft for Graf Zeppelin, causing significant delays in the process. Eventually, however, Hitler intervened forcefully, compelling Goering to cooperate. As a result, specialist naval adaptations of previously land-based aircraft finally began to appear. These included the Messerschmitt Bf-109T, T standing for Trager or carrier, a fighter aircraft, and the Junkers Ju-87C, designed to serve as both a dive bomber and a torpedo bomber. Additionally, a completely new torpedo bomber/reconnaissance biplane, the Fieseler Fi-167, was developed to operate from the Graf Zeppelin. So, with the anticipated mix of aircraft in the original plans, the carrier would have carried 20 Fi-167s, 10 Bf-109Ts, and 12 Ju-87Cs. This composition reveals the early German view of the carrier's role. The majority of the aircraft were intended for scouting and torpedo attacks against enemy ships, while a smaller number of fighters would provide cover. This approach mirrored and indeed copied from the British doctrine of the 1930s, which employed their aircraft in a very similar manner. Eventually, the Germans revised their plans and reversed the original aircraft ratio. Later proposals envisioned the Graf Zeppelin carrying 30 Ju-87Cs, 12 Bf-109Ts, and eliminating the reconnaissance biplanes altogether. In other words, the ship's mission profile shifted toward an attack role, with bombers taking precedence over scouting planes. The outbreak of war and delayed construction. So, when World War II broke out in September 1939, Graf Zeppelin, launched in 1938, was only about 85% complete and had not been commissioned into service. Her hull was finished, her engines were installed, and the good news was she was afloat. But many essential components, armament, the aircraft handling gear, electronics, and other stuff like that remained unfinished. Initially, the Kriegsmarine had hoped to rush the carrier to completion, aiming to commission her in 1940. However, the outbreak of war forced Germany to reconsider its priorities immediately. Instead, the proven effectiveness of U-boats in wreaking havoc on Allied shipping, along with other pressing defensive requirements, took precedence over large unfinished projects, no matter how potentially useful those large unfinished projects might be. Grand Admiral Erich Raeder, then commander of the Kriegsmarine, was not pleased with that shift. He argued that even a lone carrier could be useful, perhaps escorting German surface raiders such as the battleships Bismarck and Scharnhorst and the cruiser Prince Eugen on Atlantic sorties. His naval staff, however, was skeptical and agreed with the orders coming in from Berlin, concluding in October 1939, just weeks into the war at this point, that a single carrier would have, quote, no apparent place in the ongoing conflict, although we assume that was in German. In their view, operating a carrier in the confined North Sea within range of both British land-based bombers and the abjectly underbrowning prospect that was the Royal Navy's home fleet was simply too damn risky. They believed that it wasn't worth expending even one additional man-hour of labor on this endeavor. And they had a point. Graf Zeppelin, Germany's sole carrier, would undoubtedly be the creme de la creme of targets for the Royal Navy, a vessel that would be remembered much like the sinking of Bismarck is today. Naturally, Germany was keen to secure her. However, unlike the massive multi-carrier task forces used by the US, Japan, and Britain, Germany practically had nothing to send along with her for protection. In fact, the service fleet of the Kriegsmarine was so small and already overstretched that it is doubtful Germany could even have assembled a single carrier group. And with all that in mind, in May 1940, the same month as Germany launched its lightning conquest of France, work on the Graf Zeppelin was officially suspended. The changing course of naval warfare and Hitler's renewed interest. Now, had Nazi Germany had any sense, a big ask from the regime, we know, but do bear with us here, we would now be transitioning into the video's conclusion with words like, "And so it sat in Kiel port for the next 5 years, did bugger all and was scrapped in whatever year, blah blah blah." But alas, we are discussing Nazi Germany, aren't we? A nation led by a fellow with a questionable grip on reality at the best of times. Thus, what actually happened was that the Graf Zeppelin was finally to be finished. At that point, it would supposedly race out of the harbour, give the business to the Royal Navy, and then happy days, glorious fascist victory, 1,000-year Reich, all of that shit, blah, blah, blah. You know how it goes. The first event that pushed Hitler toward irrationality, at least in the carrier department, was the Battle of Taranto in November 1940. In that engagement, the Royal Navy launched a daring carrier strike against the Italian fleet moored in the titular port. What really inspired Hitler, however, was the fact that the British executed this feat with rickety old fairy swordfish biplanes. So just imagine what he could do by letting his mighty Stukas rip from the deck of the Graf Zeppelin. And that idea cooked in Hitler's mind for a while, only to be reinforced further in May 1941 by the sinking of the Bismarck, once again at the hands of swordfishers. The more he observed these events, the more convinced he became that the battleship was an outdated concept and that the age of the carrier had truly arrived. And what would you know? He had just the planes needed to fully cash in on this fact. Now, in fairness, he wasn't entirely wrong in that assertion, objectively. However, much like a fresh graduate getting fleeced when financing a posh car, he was contemplating writing checks that he simply could not afford. We have specific examples of his continued musing on this matter. For instance, at a dinner in August 1941, he remarked, quoting here, "There is something tragic in the fact that the battleship, that monument of human ingenuity, has lost its entire raison d'etre because of the development of aviation." End quote. Admiral Reid, of his part, was as happy as a pig in muck with Hitler's new line of thinking. He seized every opportunity to fan those flames, hoping that maybe, finally, his much-coveted carrier would be completed. Then came the attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941, a devastating display that produced countless images of American capital ships sinking or already sunk by carrier-launched aircraft. These scenes poured yet more petrol onto the fire in Hitler's mind. The straw that broke the camel's back, however, and finally got Hitler fully back on board the carrier hype train, wasn't nearly as dramatic as the Battle of Taranto or the attack on Pearl Harbor. Instead, it was a simple convoy interdiction action in March 1942 that ultimately sealed the deal. The convoy in question was PQ-12, sailing from Reykjavik, Iceland to Murmansk in the Soviet Union between the 1st and the 12th of that month. The battleship Tirpitz, operating from occupied Norway, moved in to cause some damage, but was sent packing after a single attack run by swordfishers, and not even one of those hits actually connected. That innocuous little action, for some reason, changed Hitler's mind. Before the month was out, Germany went all in on carriers once again, and we mean all in. Not only was the Graf Zeppelin ordered to be completed, but the unfinished heavy cruiser Seydlitz was also directed to be finished as a converted carrier. In addition, the ocean liners SS Europa, Gneisenau, and Potsdam were ordered to be pulled in and bodged into auxiliary carriers. Much like the Graf Zeppelin herself, none of these conversions were ever finished, but it still does prove the point. The 1942 refit. So, Graf Zeppelin entered dry dock in May 1942, several years after her launch, at a time when naval technology had advanced a really long way. And with that in mind, the task at hand was not only to complete her construction, but also to retrofit her to meet the latest top-of-the-line standards, a job that proved extensive, to say the least. For one thing, her flight deck and hangar equipment needed reinforcement. The newer versions of the Bf-109 and Ju-87, which would operate from the ship, were considerably heavier than before, and the original deck equipment simply wasn't sturdy enough. To address this, stronger launching catapults were designed to provide the necessary oomph to get these aircraft into the sky, while the arresting gear, the wires that catch the landing aircraft, was equipped with robust winches capable of bringing them to a safe stop upon touchdown. Her islands, that's the command tower on the deck, was also redesigned to include a proper combat information center fully loaded with radar and new fire control systems, making it a vital and essential nerve center for coordinating her defenses and aerial operations. This upgrade required additional armor protection and a taller funnel to vent smoke clear of the sensitive electronics. Now, all of these modifications added weight high up on the ship, threatening to make her a bit top-heavy. To compensate for that, engineers added large bulges along the lower hull for extra buoyancy and stability. These bulges could double as storage for fuel and offer some torpedo protection from absorbing blasts, a trick pinched from other navies. Graf Zeppelin's anti-aircraft battery was significantly beefed up as well. Originally, she had only a few light AA guns, but the refit planned to equip her with an array of 28 twin 20mm guns and 22 37mm guns, to name just a few. Her crew complement was also increased to 1,760 officers and men so that she could effectively operate all of that added extra equipment. Equally important was the earlier mentioned change in air group composition. But that's old water for now, we're not going to retread it. By late 1942, work was well underway and progressing nicely, with German naval staff aiming to have her ready for sea trials by mid-1943. Interestingly, around this time, she also moved about quite a bit. As a top priority military asset, whenever there were lulls in her refit, she was towed out into the Baltic to hide from potential aerial attacks. This maneuver drew the attention of Allied intelligence on more than one occasion, and was often a source of squeaky bum time as concerns set in that maybe she had been finished and some action was imminent. The final cancellation and abandonment. Alright, so where'd it all go wrong then? Because all of that did sound rather promising, didn't it? Well, fate, as it turned out, had one last cruel twist in store for Graf Zeppelin, and naturally, it was not in her favor. You see, by the start of 1943, Germany's war situation had shifted dramatically. It was now absolutely dire. Take the Battle of Stalingrad alone, for example. That battle ended in February 1943 with a decisive defeat for Germany, resulting in as many as 1.5 million casualties. The situation was just as grim in North Africa. The campaign was still underway, don't get us wrong, but after the Second Battle of El Alamein in late 1942, when the Germans were absolutely creamed, their final defeat and withdrawal from that theatre were all but inevitable. Put simply, Germany had suffered and continued to suffer so many losses that they were now on the defensive. Despite the occasional attempt to break through here and there, they would remain on the back foot until the war finally reached the steps of the Reich Chancellery, and the mustachioed man did a bit of bunker redecoration with his grey matter. And on the subject of him, he really was not taking the news well. Big ships, which had been so keen on just a year earlier, had now become one of the many scapegoats he used to explain his nation's ever-worsening strategic situation. In one instance, during a December 1942 tirade complete with stereotypically aggressive table banging, he even suggested that Germany should scrap all of its so-called luxury ships and repurpose the steel for U-boat construction. Raeder, for his part, had finally reached his wit's end. He resigned from his post as commander of the Kriegsmarine on January 13, 1943. Some sources claim that his resignation stemmed from his inability to cope with an increasingly erratic Führer, while others suggest it was due to a tantrum over the realization that he was never likely to receive his much-coveted carrier. Whatever the reason, he was replaced by Admiral Karl Donitz, a U-boat man by trade who had little interest in surface warships. This development pleased Hitler, for his new hire was only too happy to go along with his idea of immediately halting all big ship construction, Graf Zeppelin included. In February 1943, the order came in to stop work on her once again, this time for good. At that point, Graf Zeppelin was still far from being combat ready, so the loss probably not as dire as it could have been. For instance, only 2 of her 4 propeller shafts had been installed. The plan had been to have them working by late 1942 in order to conduct minimal sea trials, but even that goal was never realized. No aircraft had yet flown from her decks, and many of her guns and electronic systems just remained unfitted. Germany's Grand Carrier had become nothing more than an unfinished white elephant. And with Allied bombing raids intensifying, keeping Graf Zeppelin in a shipyard just became increasingly dangerous. Her presence would only encourage more attacks. Thus, in April 1943, she was towed to a remote backwater on the Baltic coast, a shallow arm of the Oder River near the port of Stettin, now Szczecin in Poland. Far from the reach of most enemy bombers, she was moored and camouflaged with nets and paint. A skeleton crew of about 40 caretakers, mainly civilian workers, were left behind to tend to the ship, essentially preventing any major deterioration. And from that point on, she served no military purpose other than as a storage hulk. In 1944, an inspection even considered converting her into a floating barracks for trainees, but that idea was dropped, and another inspection by Vice Admiral Friedrich Ruger declared the ship absolutely useless in its current state. Some of her remaining parts were scavenged. For instance, a few of her small engines were removed and used to help repair German battleships. Otherwise, she just rusted away quietly. Scuttling and the Soviets' interest. By 1945, any notion of getting her operational was just fantasy. Even if Germany had somehow miraculously completed her that late in the war, she would have been hopelessly outclassed. Allied naval air power was simply overwhelming by 1944-45, with dozens of Allied carriers, including many smaller escort carriers, roaming the Atlantic at any given time. A lone, hastily finished German carrier with no experienced aircrew would just not have survived. Even the German naval staff admitted in 1944 that Graf Zeppelin would have been an antiquated vessel compared to Allied carriers, which by then benefited from years of hard-won combat experience. The fate was sealed when Soviet forces advanced into Pomerania in the spring of 1945. Determined to deny their enemy any usable war material and acting on orders from Donitz, the Germans began scuttling all ships moored in Baltic ports that could not either be towed out or fired up and sailed out under their own steam. The specific orders for Graf Zeppelin's scuttling arrived in late March when the Red Army was nearing Stettin. In response, the crew opened every valve they could get their hands on to flood her lower compartments, including engine rooms, which caused the carrier to settle by the bow and become stuck fast in the shallow mud of the Oder Inlet. They then abandoned ship, reportedly even removing vital parts like the valve mechanisms and sending them west so the Soviets wouldn't be able to easily refloat the ship if they captured it. By the 25th of April, the Red Army had reached the area and begun shelling anything of military value, and Graf Zeppelin, immobile and defenseless, was an easy target. In a bizarre twist, however, as artillery began pounding away at her hull, the Germans found their way aboard once again. Word had reached Donitz that she wasn't exactly sunk by the most strict definition of the word, and he wanted that issue corrected. Consequently, the German demolition team snuck aboard for one last act of destruction, setting off explosive charges in the ship's hull and machinery spaces, wrecking her engines, and opening great holes in her bottom. The once proud Graf Zeppelin was left a flooded, burned-out ruin, stuck in the mud. As intended, she'd be no use to the Soviets. The war in Europe ended soon after. Germany's surrender was in May 1945. But the story today doesn't quite end there. Determined to claim whatever spoils they could, the Soviets examined the shattered carrier and discovered that despite the scuttling and artillery damage, her hull was actually largely intact. And so, in 1946, Soviet salvage crews managed to refloat Graf Zeppelin. They patched holes, pumped water out, and on the 19th of March 1946, she was raised from the mud and towed out to deeper water. They designated the hulk PO-101 and reportedly considered whether it was worth repairing or studying. Ultimately, the answer was a firm no, and they decided instead to use her for target practice, with her finally disappearing beneath the waves on the 16th of August, 1947. At which point, her story did come to an end. Much like this video. Thanks for watching.